Okay guys, please smash that like button and hit the subscribe button to receive our future audiobooks and videos. Without you, there is no us. The Greek individual names are difficult to pronounce. We apologize in advance. Reading of Genesis chapter 16. Part 1. Original King James Version. Verse 1. Now Sarai Abram's wife bare him no children, and she had an handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. Verse 2. And Sarai said unto Abram, Behold now, the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go in unto my maid, it may be that I may obtain children by her. And Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarai. Verse 3. And Sarai Abram's wife took Hagar her maid the Egyptian, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife. Verse 4. And he went in unto Hagar, and she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her eyes. Verse 5. And Sarai said unto Abram, My wrong be upon thee. I have given my maid into thy bosom. And when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her eyes. The Lord judge between me and thee. Verse 6. But Abram said unto Sarai, Behold, thy maid is in thy hand, do to her as it pleaseth thee. And when Sarai dealt hardly with her, she fled from her face. Verse 7. And the angel of the Lord found her by a fountain of water in the wilderness, by the fountain in the way to Shur. Verse 8. And he said, Hagar, Sarai's maid, whence camest thou? And whither wilt thou go? And she said, I flee from the face of my mistress Sarai. Verse 9. And the angel of the Lord said unto her, Return to thy mistress, and submit thyself under her hands. Verse 10. And the angel of the Lord said unto her, I will multiply thy seed exceedingly, that it shall not be numbered for multitude. Verse 11. And the angel of the Lord said unto her, Behold, thou art with child, and shalt bear a son, and shalt call his name Ishmael, because the Lord hath heard thy affliction. Verse 12. And he will be a wild man, his hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. Verse 13. And she called the name of the Lord that spake unto her, Thou God seest me. For she said, Have I also here looked after him that seeth me? Verse 14. Wherefore the well was called Beer Lahai Roi, behold, it is between Kadesh and Beard. Verse 15. And Hagar bare Abram a son, and Abram called his son's name, which Hagar bare, Ishmael. Verse 16. And Abram was 86 years old, when Hagar bare Ishmael to Abram. Part 2. Easy to understand version. Sarai and her maid Hagar. Verse 1. Sarai, who was Abram's wife, had no children. She had an Egyptian maid, whose name was Hagar. Verse 2. Sarai said to Abram, The Lord has made me unable to produce children. Lie with my maid and have sex with her. Perhaps I shall obtain children by her. And Abram did what Sarai suggested. Verse 3. Abram had then lived for 10 years in the country that is called Canaan. Sarai, who was Abram's wife, took her maid Hagar, the Egyptian. Sarai gave Hagar to Abram her husband so that Hagar could be his wife. Verse 4. And Abram had sex with Hagar and she became pregnant. When Hagar knew this, she did not respect Sarai. Verse 5. And Sarai said to Abram, Hagar does not respect me. I pray that the blame for this will be on you. I gave my maid to you to have sex with you. As soon as she became pregnant, she did not respect me. I want the Lord to be a judge. I pray that he will blame either you or me. Verse 6. But Abram said to Sarai, You may control your own maid. Do to her whatever you decide to do. Then Sarai was cruel to Hagar, and Hagar ran away from Sarai. God rescues Hagar. Verse 7. The Lord's angel found Hagar by a well of water in the desert. That well is on the way to Shur. Verse 8. And the angel said, Hagar, Sarai's maid, where have you come from? Where do you go? She said, I have run away from Sarai, whom I served. Verse 9. The Lord's angel said to her, Return to Sarai, whom you served. Serve her again and obey her. Verse 10. The Lord's angel also said to Hagar, I will make you have a great number of descendants. They will be so many that nobody will be able to count them. Verse 11. And the Lord's angel said to her, You are pregnant and a son will be born to you. You shall call him Ishmael, because the Lord has heard you in your trouble. Verse 12. He shall live like a wild donkey. He will be every man's enemy and every man shall be his enemy. He will live in front of all his relatives. Verse 13. So Hagar gave a name to the Lord who spoke to her. She called him, You are a God who sees. She said, I have really seen the God who sees me. Verse 14. Therefore people call the well Beer Lahai Roi. It is between Kadesh and Beard. Verse 15. And Hagar had a son for Abram. And Abram called his son Ishmael. Verse 16. Abram was 86 years of age when Ishmael was born to Hagar for Abram. Side notes. Verse 3. Genesis tells us that several of God's ancient people had 2 wives. But that does not mean that to have 2 wives is right. Abram's wife was Sarai. Abram took Hagar as an extra wife. He did that because he had no son. God had promised that Abram would have a son. See Genesis chapter 15 verse 4. But Abram thought that he must do something. He thought that otherwise God's promise would not happen. But God wanted Abram to trust him. God did not want Abram to marry Hagar. God gave Abram a son, by his wife Sarai, when the time was right. See Genesis chapter 21 verses 1 and 2. God wanted Abram to wait for that time. Verses 4 through 6. Sarai was Abram's wife and Hagar was only an extra wife. But Sarai had no child and Hagar was pregnant. Hagar would soon produce a child for Abram. So Hagar thought that she was equal in rank to Sarai. Sarai blamed Abram for this, and Abram did not help her. Sarai wanted to show that Hagar was only a maid. So she was cruel to Hagar. Verse 7. An angel is a servant of God who brings messages from heaven. But in this verse, the Lord's angel means God himself. He did not send a servant, but he came himself. We know that because of the words in verse 13. Verse 8. God already knew where Hagar had come from. He asked the question so that Hagar would speak to him. Verse 9. God often says this to people who run away from difficulties. He says, I know that things were difficult, but go back and overcome the difficulties. I will be with you and I will help you. Verse 10. God intended that Abram would have only one wife, Sarai. He did not tell Abram to take an extra wife, Hagar. So God did not intend that Abram should have descendants by Hagar. But God loves people, so he looked after those descendants. And he promised to make them a great nation. Verse 11. Ishmael means God heard. Verse 12. God had promised that Abram's descendants by his wife Sarai would live in Canaan. And God had also promised that Abram's descendants by Hagar's son Ishmael would be a great nation. So Ishmael's descendants could not live in Canaan because there was not enough space for both nations. Therefore Ishmael's descendants would live in the desert. We are not sure what the last sentence in verse 12 means. Sometimes in the Bible, in front of means to the east of. Verse 14. Bir Lahai Roy means the well of the one who lives and sees. She may have meant, I have seen God and I am still alive. Please allow us this opportunity to thank all our viewers and subscribers alike. Without you, this channel isn't possible.